So, we've always had a kind of fascination with vision, and about 30 years ago, when I was a graduate student, I was doing these very rudimentary experiments with this idea of parallax, with the idea of looking at two things at once, or how do you read multiple screens. And then, almost exactly 30 years later, I got an email from the American hip-hop artist Kanye West, and it had this image on it, a collage that he had made, and he wrote to us saying he was interested in making a film that would happen on 7 screens simultaneously. And so there's in this 30-year gap between these really rudimentary experiments and this very strange and complex project, there was this transformation in our work. And what I want to do tonight is talk about that transformation. At first, for the first half of the talk, really a quick run through 30 years and talk about how that transformation in design affected our transformation of our work. And the second half of the lecture, to look at that in a historical perspective, in a kind of theoretical talk about what happened to the way we see in the last 150 years. So in the prologue then, to talk about the studio, my partners Susan Sellers, who's here tonight, and Georgie Stout and I started the studio about 25 years ago. And in the beginning, like many graphic design studios, we were a small group of 3 people working together making print. And one of the first things we started to do was make a very obscure, very cheap magazine about architecture in New York called Any Magazine. And it was really a perfect project because almost nobody read it, and so you could do almost anything you want. And so we had this period where we just played with design through this magazine, but in a very structured way. And one of the things we also did in that period was we did a series of books for the same group of architectural critics called the Any series. And the Any series was really a kind of meditation on the grid and how when you set a set of rules for yourself, you can play that out. And so if you look at a single issue, this is one issue called Anytime. What's interesting, I think, about this book when you see it at this speed is you start to see a kind of structure in terms of the way the book moves and the way that things move and compositionally across the page. And we were really thinking a lot about this composition and animation, even animation at the level of a book. We went on to do a whole series of strange books, some which are done and some which are not. This is one that's not done. We worked on for about 10 years still. It's not finished, which is a book with Rem Coolhouse about the city Lagos in Nigeria. And it was really an experiment to make a book which was made simultaneously by many people. And so the way that Lagos worked was that there's a series of chapters. Each one has its own content, its own design. And the book would be made just by making all these chapters and then ultimately stacking them up and making a big, fat book with lots of different parts to it. In a way, a book that contained all other books. Other things here also with Coolhouse, a book about architecture where we tried to look at architecture in the ways that it's normally not looked at. In other words, to change the representation of architecture. And so, for instance, we looked at architecture of how it was reported on the television news the day of its opening, or the way that buildings are reflected in their neighbors, or the kind of pictures people publish online about buildings, or even using the building's own security cameras as a kind of automatic photography device, so to see the building through its own security apparatus. And most recently, a book of the studio and some of my writing, which again was conceived of as really a set of completely different conditions, some of them written, some of them projects, some of them lectures or essays, and that the book would really be a collection of all of these different typologies brought into one. And I think that was a theme that ran through a lot of that early work, was to play with the typologies of design in different ways. In those early days, we were also involved pretty deeply in the idea of using design as a kind of research, and we were deeply involved with the group AMO, which was the think tank that was part of OMA at the time. And one of the projects we did early on was a project for Wired magazine, the American tech magazine. And it was a time when Wired magazine was doing quite poorly, and so we wanted to understand what the magazine was about. So we counted all the words that had ever been published in Wired. And when you took away all of the thes and ands, the most published word in Wired was new. And so that was interesting to us because it suggested it wasn't a magazine about technology, but a magazine about newness. Or we charted, for instance, the number of times the magazine published the word revolution by every issue. And we found that every 3 issues there was a huge spike in the use of the word revolution. So it was a magazine about permanently predicting revolutions. So these kind of information graphics were ways to understand through analysis and creating design. We did this project also for Wired's publisher, Condé Nast, as a tool for developing new magazines. And what we proposed was that if you created a marriage between their old magazines, their children could be new magazines. So GQ plus Architectural Digest would create a new magazine called Bachelor Pad. So there would be a way of generating constantly new ideas. And then we did things like this. Here it's an analysis of the corporate colors of the top 200 corporations in the world. And you can see there's a huge interest in red and blue, and green and pink have great potential for development. So they were all graphics of ways to look at the world through graphic analysis. And then some of that analysis started to turn into buildings, because in the early days when we worked with Coolhouse and architects, nothing really got built. We didn't win competitions, and we made a lot of discussion, but we didn't necessarily build. But then early on, there was a competition in Chicago for a building on the campus of the Illinois Institute of Chicago. And so those early diagrams, like this one, which is a diagram that showed, it's in plan, showing where the students walk from their apartments to the campus. And that diagram ultimately became a plan for a building, and that building ultimately got built. And it's a building that is underneath a train track, and so it has a huge soundproof tunnel, so when the train goes over the roof of the building, it becomes quiet, and the building can exist underneath it. And the campus of IIT was famously designed by Mies van der Rohe, the German architect, and so we made this homage to Mies by having his face on the front of the building, and the doors open up and you kind of enter into his mouth, so you're kind of swallowed by Mies van der Rohe as you enter into the building. And then when you go inside, you can see there are these huge portraits of the guys who started the university. And one of the things, this building was a center for student activities, and so we developed a kind of graphic language for all of the different kinds of activities the students would do. And then there were some activities that we represented, but the school rejected. But you can still find them hidden in the building somewhere. And the idea was that we would make these large-scale iconography, but as you got close to these buildings, to these images, they would dissolve into these little figures. So there was a break between the monumental and the individual, and so you had this kind of play between small and big. And that building was a whole series of strange surfaces, like these wallpapers that moved, or kind of fuzzy wallpaper, or walls that have text embedded in them with light. And we continued on with Coolhouse and a series of other projects here in Las Vegas, a special museum for the Guggenheim, where the museum was built inside a casino, and you walked from the casino into the museum, and you had these really large-scale graphic gestures that moved all throughout. So you can see you're kind of, when you come into the museum through this big glass bridge, you're inside the typography, and you're looking out through that typography into the museum. And then even there, the ceiling of the museum is the Sistine Chapel. So you're in a casino in Las Vegas looking through Michelangelo into the Nevada sky. And these projects with Coolhouse and with OMA, always playing with surface in some ways, or this aspect of depth. Here, a theater in Dallas, Texas, this beautiful typography that's drilled through the front of the building, so you have light that comes out through the typography. And that theater is made to be, in a special way, a glass box that you sit in, and then when the performance starts, these blackout shades come down and close the box. And so we printed that with this texture, so you have a sense of softness even though it's a flat surface. And so the relationship between the hard building and then this soft wall, even the soft wall is fake. So again, playing with the trompe-l'oeil of the building. And here in Beijing, in the gigantic CCTV tower, a whole series of other kinds of strange installations where making imagery, for instance, with simple tile, but using this idiom of the Chinese blue ceramic, but filling whole spaces with that or walls. And another here in Hong Kong, building for Chanel, where the entire building is a kind of illuminated box. And we wanted to play there with the idea that the video, the building which is made of video, would defy its own boxness or its own architectonic quality. And so we created a kind of deep space through video where the box becomes a kind of unknowable space. That work with OMA continued on through a whole series of interventions for some spaces for the fashion company Prada, and that started this relationship with them, which has now been almost 20 years. And we've done a whole series of these experiments in those spaces that have allowed us to try these different places where graphic interacts with space. And first in New York, this is the Coolhouse designed Prada store in New York. And there, the north wall of the store is a 200-foot-long wall, which every few months we change. And so we kind of inject a graphic design into an architectural space. So here, for instance, these large-scale images that are made up by people in stadiums holding up cards. So you get this kind of strange, tiny little faces that watch you as you shop. And in this installation, we started to play also with these installations of mannequins. And so you can see these kind of armies of mannequins which are all identical. And so then we started to think about, well, what happens when the mannequins leave work and they go home and they live in this kind of paradise where they frolic with butterflies and deer, and so kind of creating a new life for the mannequins. And so the wall really is a place like the magazine in the beginning for us just to experiment. There's no assignment here, but really just to try different things. So here in this version, we created an identity for a false company called Gilt. And so the wall became a kind of branding manual for the Gilt Corporation with all of its attendant products. And the Gilt Corporation even has a kind of manifesto that's part of the installation. Or here, these portraits of these huge portraits of women who are known for their power rather than their beauty. And then another version of that where their faces are taken away and they're masked with these strange kind of eerily cheerful masks. Walls where we actually plaster on top of the wall. Or in this one, we commissioned 100 oil paintings from an oil painting village in China, and the wall becomes a collage of actual oil paint, so you have this kind of strange surface that gets layered on. And then that continued on a series of activities onto much larger and larger scale. So here in Tokyo, the imagery coming out of the building and up the facade, so the whole building starts to become taken over by the graphic. And that project has taken all these different forms. This is a project we did recently in Milan, where to take that idea of the wall that becomes graphic, but here we created a space actually for a fashion show, and we invited 7 sort of well-known street artists from around the world to come and work for a month and just completely paint the interior of the space. And so it was a way of kind of creating graphic over time. And one of the interesting things about Prada is that after doing that, the design then found its way onto the clothing. So there was this transfer from something that first started as a graphic space and then becomes part of the fashion space. So the portraits that were wall spaces become dresses. And then bags and other wallpaper and other things. And so a project starts in one place and then changes and moves through others as well. And then around the same time we started to do that, we started to work increasingly on screens rather than on surfaces. And the screen work took on all these different forms. Here, like a small film that plays on 23 screens simultaneously, so a kind of wraparound experience where you can see, kind of see simultaneously both the future and the past of a film. And then other films that happen in parallel with other ones. And so this kind of installation into the store of moving images as well as fixed images. And some of those things kind of you find nestled or hanging demurely between the clothing. And they become interactive in ways. And so here, these screens that become kind of mirrors. And in this mirror, it's a mirror that makes you anonymous. So it's kind of like a Japanese porn filter, and it makes the part of you that's most recognizable becomes pixelated. Or in this one, it's a screen which is really only recording a single line of pixels at a time, and as people move by the screen, it captures them. So it's a way of kind of collecting passersby. And then a whole series of other kinds of screen-based projects. In here, we developed a kind of mannequin who's made out of information. And so every time she walks or he walks to the screen, their body is written with the latest news. So it takes the RSS feed and projects it onto a body. And so if you think about fashion being always up to date, this is the most up-to-date body you can have. Or in these ladies who are huge, they're about 8 meters tall, these gigantic projections. The ladies are made out of information which grows and changes as their bodies move. And so the body is both simultaneously growing and falling apart as they move through the space. So you have this kind of immediate form of newness. And that has generated all different kinds of work around this idea of multiplication and change and magnification. Because, of course, fashion is always about producing more and more stuff. And so the images always try to play with that idea of production and commodity and reproduction. And some of them play in just very formal ways. So here, a program which only records about this much of a model as she walks down the runway. So basically the color is purely driven by one body in one moment. And then we started to do a whole series of kind of larger scale things where all of those aspects came together, screen and curatorial and design and print, all in different ways. And this was an exhibition that we did in London, Harrods, where we did 40 windows along Knightsbridge, and then leading up to a large scale installation in the upstairs of Harrods. And the idea was to create a completely immersive exhibition around one subject, around this company. And so as you move through the store, you're kind of drawn into this big space. And there we developed basically a concept of the space as almost a natural history museum of Prada. And so you break down to topologies, specimens, evolution, kind of what all the different qualities are. And then to design really in this very deep, careful way the space. And so the space you walk into and it's completely lavish. And each case designed again in the kind of spirit of the 19th century museum contains these specimens. And it was the chance to really do something where we designed the language, the curatorial aspect, the film, and the architecture as well. And part of the thinking was to look at something which happens over a historical period of time, but take away the time aspect of it. So in these cases, you see work which is sometimes 30 years apart, but brought together because it shares certain kinds of qualities. And then again, to look at the evolution in a hyper-time way, so to see the entire evolution of all the things that the company's done in these very long interactive walls, to produce these lavish books and these different kinds of displays. So to really create this thing where you can understand it in all these different ways. And in the end of that hall, we developed this kind of large-scale walk where these women are constantly kind of approaching you from the back. And again, it combines work from maybe 30 years apart over the course of her career. But it's only organized here by color, and so instead of seeing it as temporal, you see it through this formal device, and so it keeps passing through all of these different iterations of the collections. And then that also has a handheld version of it where you can navigate in different ways. And we continued then to do a whole series of spaces that start to investigate more and more this relationship of how the screen relates to the space. And this was an exhibition we did in Tokyo where the theme of the collection was around this idea of women and driving. And so we created this whole roadside, basically, with a series of signs and screens and billboards that as you approach the show, you're kind of drawn into it. And then we designed an exhibition in a parking garage where you enter into this fabulous kind of fantasy car lot. And that lot is surrounded by these images which are projected onto the wall, which constantly give you the idea that you're driving through. So it's basically a kind of out the windshield view of the world. So you're kind of looking through the wall at all times. And in that space then where the fashion show happens, you're in a kind of bay of a parking garage. We created this film which accompanies the show. And the film is basically 500 clips of women driving, so it makes one long journey through all these different forms. This goes on for 20 minutes, so I'll save you from that. But so you have 500 clips that you basically follow this one long journey through all of these different tropes of driving films. And then recently we've been getting interested in this idea of a space where the architecture and the video become a kind of integrated form. And this is a project we did just recently in Paris, which is to create a kind of club for the night, which serves one function is to be a club, but then the one room has this kind of very specialized place where you can experience some perfume. So in that space, we created this little room, very kind of luxurious little velvet room. And the walls there are animated with all of these kind of live collages. And so we take this imagery where kind of one thing is cut through another thing, which is cut through another. And then that becomes kind of the animating feature of the wall. So you can see, this is kind of a shot of my cell phone, but the walls become alive and they have this activity to them. And so the graphic and the architecture really become kind of one component to the whole thing. And we've continued that with recently another project, again, where a combination of using video and mirror together to completely dissolve the architecture of the space. And so you're never quite sure if you're seeing a wall, a reflection, or a projection at once. And so these spaces, here, for instance, are completely doubled by mirrors, so you get this kind of strange architecture. And I just have a little bit I can show you of that, I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So this idea of, what seems to be solid falls away, what seems to be reflection is actually a wall, that you create this almost fantastical space where everything is in motion, everything's changing, everything is reflecting each other. And another project here where kind of, again, installing video into architecture. And so this is back in New York again at the Coolhouse design store, where we turn that main staircase in the store into a screen itself. So the stair itself becomes a kind of fragmented screen where image breaks down throughout and passes through the store. So the stairway itself becomes, the treads of the stair become the facade of the video. And then that that move away from print and increasingly toward a kind of design that's in an ephemeral space, in a video space, becomes more and more public. And this is a project we did a couple of years ago, and the idea was to create a design manifesto that would be crowdsourced. And so we developed an interface where anybody could propose a 3-word design manifesto. And so we would collect over time all of these different lines for the manifesto, and it always had to follow the same rules, which was that it had to be a verb, a preposition, and a noun. So brand with nature, think with pictures, solve through questions. And so we started to collect this list, and what we found was more and more we started to collect thousands of these lines. And so that became then kind of a public performance, really, of a design manifesto, where all of these phrases written by different designers all over the world became a kind of ongoing building manifesto. And we then worked out a system so that that manifesto could play in the most public place in New York, in Times Square. And so using all of the screens at Times Square at a certain point, during Design Week in New York, it became a kind of public manifesto of the city. And so to use the kind of commercial space and refigure that into a different kind of space. And so it was a way of injecting this content all through the city in that way. And then to extend that out, basically, the screen continues on into the New York City taxis. So taxis now have little taxi TVs in them. And so the design manifesto went from the most public thing to the really private thing, where in 7,000 taxis in New York, you would get this design manifesto. So it's a way of distribution. And then finally, this kind of other use of screen, where this is the exhibition for Kanye West's first collection of fashion, where we inverted the screen and made the screen the ceiling. And the idea was to use the screen as a illumination device. So instead of a normal fashion show where the girls or guys walk and the people stay fixed, here everyone's fixed, they stay in one place, and the top illuminates and kind of defines different areas of the fashion. So you have this kind of play between the screen on the ceiling and the people below it. So all of that is in preface to this kind of bigger discussion about what happened to design in this period and this relationship between design and public and the screen. And so I wanted to take you through a very quick history of this relationship. And I start off this discussion with the invention of plate glass. And the reason that plate glass is important is that when you start to have these big scale windows in cities, for the first time you have this kind of performative relationship of buildings to the street. And they really become kind of like screens in themselves. The first screens become these windows with things behind them. And you start to see things like this for the first time, where people actually stare at buildings in the front of them. And people stop and look, and it becomes this way of animating the street through the screen. And Walter Benjamin famously said that plate glass invented fashion, because as soon as you had windows like that, then people wanted to see new stuff behind them. And so this idea of the screen as this big piece of glass that could be seen and could be recomposed and could change animates the city in a way that was never animated before. And when you start to see windows in sequence like this, it really becomes like screens in the street, where you see like stories that are played out one after another. And if you combine that invention of plate glass with something like the injection of electricity and signage into a city, you get this interesting combination where typography and signs become almost a screen in themselves. And this next clip is from an early film from the 30s, but what I love about what I love about that is like the way that the typography itself becomes a kind of surface without anything around it, like a screen through which you see the city or the architecture behind it. And so you start to get this sense of dislocation between the billboard, the typography, the screen, and then the city itself. And so this very complicated relationship between images, information, and architecture. So if you look at something like the Times Square in New York, which is the most famous, square in the middle of the city. And in 1900, Times Square looked like this. In the 1920s, it was like this. The 30s, the 40s, and now. And you can sort of say, well, what happened to the city? Because it dissolves behind this huge layer of information and of screens. And so all of this graphic and information material becomes a screen which hides the architecture behind it. And I know in Moscow you have laws against this, but in many major cities that's what depicts a downtown, really. Here in downtown Shibuya in Tokyo, if you've ever been to Shibuya, it's an amazing experience to walk into this extravaganza of information. Or in Hong Kong, where the signs kind of come off the buildings and actually fill the street, and you have this kind of preponderance of information. And so this has become basically the look of kind of urban places overall, where you have a series, almost a collage of graphic material, one thing that lays over the other. And what's interesting about that is that when you start to create a thin graphic layer over something, there starts to become a kind of relationship between what you see and what's hidden. And so I'll take a brief discussion into conspiracy theory, because this idea of what's hidden becomes important. So if you look at this billboard, it's a very famous photograph by Margaret Bourke-White from the period of the Depression in America. And it says, "World's highest standard of living, there's no way like the American way." And this was seen as this very ironic commentary on American culture, because the people in line are all waiting for bread, and you have this kind of very idealistic image, something everyone's familiar with, a kind of propagandistic image of prosperity. And it's interesting because Terry Gilliam, when he made the movie Brazil in 1982, repeats that image almost exactly. It says, happiness, we're all in it together. And you have this, again, this kind of very ironic relationship of the propaganda to the thing. And Terry Gilliam in that movie has this very beautiful image here, which is that the street, which is completely lined by billboards, and then you lift up and you see behind it its desolation. And so that represents this idea of thinness, the thinness of the graphic image that hides something behind it. And what's being hidden is always a kind of darkness or something that's wrong. And then this very happy graphic image that covers that in some way. And you see that all over. Here are some photographs we take in Beijing, and it has these very funny relationships between these images that are printed on the construction barricades of this idyllic city. It looks like you could almost step off the street into this world that's being projected, a kind of hidden thing behind the destruction that's happening behind it. And the next clip I'm going to show is from a very famous film in America called They Live. And to set it up a little bit, this guy you see in the film finds a pair of sunglasses, and the sunglasses allow him to see through the propaganda to what's really happening behind it. So this is Obey. This is Come to the Caribbean. Marry and reproduce. So it's this idea that the kind of propaganda could be peeled away, that the surface could be peeled away, and you could see the messaging behind that somehow. And so this film goes on, and it turns out that it's actually all about aliens, and so it brings together these two classic American paranoias, but one about alien infiltration and one about subliminal advertising. So they kind of come together in this perfect combination. But this is a very beautiful image of the city, kind of surrounded by these messages: consume, watch TV, stay asleep, these different things. So, but the funny thing about this film is that it suggests that there's all these hidden messages, but of course the messages aren't hidden, right? You're surrounded by these messages all the time. And the point about advertising is that it's not subliminal, it's obvious. In this next clip, it's from the film Minority Report. And it kind of predicts the future in the most extreme way, where these ads in the street actually know who you are.
Good evening, John. You can do the old-fashioned John Anderton. 21 styles provides gourmet cuisine. John Anderton, you can use a Guinness right about now. Stressed out, John Anderton.
So it's this kind of nightmare scenario where the advertising knows who you are, and it actually is programming itself for you, which is actually not that far from reality at the moment. Of course, the condition is that you are being watched all the time, that the city knows who you are, that it's programming itself for who you are, and increasingly it will be, the city will reflect what you want and what you need. And so that leads us, of course, to 1984 and Big Brother, because that's the paranoia. And there's an interesting thing about screens, which is that one of the first criticisms of screens is just purely their size, that they're just so huge. And this is a picture from around the first decade of the last century, and you can see those tiny little people on this gigantic screen. And the bigness of the screen seemed to have a power all of its own. And so here, if you look at it's the first drive-in movie in New Jersey. And what's interesting is that now, where it used to be with the windows, people walked by, now the screen moves and everyone stops. And so it's like the traffic stops to watch the screen, and that gives the screen an enormous power. And here, this is a picture in the early 60s in Grand Central Station in New York, one of the most busy places. And it was the first time a live screen was in that space. And you can see the incredible power of the screen, that suddenly everybody comes to a screeching halt and stops and watches this one thing. And that power of the screen to control the world gets coupled very early on with this other kind of megalomania. And so here in the 1932 film called Things to Come, the big screen and the big leader were one. And so the leader became a huge projected image. And so the idea of the powerful state became the relationship to the powerful screen. And you have all of these depictions then of these gigantic heads that control the world. And of course, there's already a kind of fascistic relationship of the big head that we're familiar with, the kind of gigantic head of the leader that floats over us all. But you couple that idea of the big head with the big screen, and that gives the screen this kind of special, almost magical power. And so it's interesting in the famous American film called The Wizard of Oz that what they're talking to is one of these big heads. Oh, sorry, this is also 1982, Ridley Scott, Blade Runner. Again, the gigantic head that becomes part of the city. But here's Wizard of Oz.
I'll have to give the matter a little thought. Go away and come back tomorrow.
Tomorrow? Oh, but I want to go home now.
You've had plenty of time already.
Yeah. Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz. I said come back tomorrow.
If you were really great and powerful, you'd keep your promises.
Do you presume to criticize the great Oz? You ungrateful creatures think yourselves lucky that I'm giving you audience tomorrow instead of 20 years from now. Oh, the great Oz has spoken. Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
So
The great Oz has spoken.
that line, pay no attention of that man behind the curtain, is kind of a famous touch point, because what the dog does when it pulls away the curtain is it exposes the whole apparatus of power that powers the head. And the idea that the head is just an apparition, a kind of expression of this power which is somewhere else, technological, removed, separated in a way. And that it's interesting that in 1984, Ridley Scott after Blade Runner, made the movie version of 1984, where he depicted Big Brother as a big screen. So Big Brother and big screen came together. And it was also 1984 that it was the Republican National Convention where they first used this huge screen And you have Nancy Reagan speaking to Ronald Reagan on this gigantic screen. And so you have this kind of relationship of big Reagan, Big Brother, all coming together at the same time. And it was also 1984 that this Ridley Scott made this famous ad for Apple Macintosh, which is the introduction of Apple Macintosh.
Glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th,
So-
Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So why 1984 won't be 1984? And so it suggests basically that the birth of the small screen, the personal computer, comes at the death of the big screen. And so in about 80 years, it goes from basically the big screen being power to this situation where suddenly everything's fragmented and the screen's been broken down into these individual components. So we're now familiar with this situation where everybody has their own screen, and that instead of all watching something collectively, we all watch our own thing individually. But the idea of the fragmented screen has its own history as well. And it starts, I think, in 1927 with this famous version of Napoleon by Abel Gance. And Gance made the first film that played in 3 screens simultaneously. And his theory was that the story of the invasion of Italy was so dramatic and so large, it couldn't be told on a single screen. So the idea of expanding the screen was a kind of expanding the worldview. And so he kind of broke down the story to all these components that you would see simultaneously on these screens. But really, as you move into like the 30s, here's a very famous diagram by Herbert Bayer at the Bauhaus. And I think that it starts to depict this world where you have this kind of well-dressed eyeball who's looking at this kind of array of screens, and the screens are all around for one person to see multiple screens. And that's right about the time that you start to see these images of these television control rooms where guys are sitting down and looking at screens and watching multiple things at once. And in about 1954, Hitchcock made this film, Rear Window. And Rear Window was the film of a story of this guy who was a photographer who had broken his leg so he couldn't leave his apartment. And everything he watched out the back window of his apartment at other windows.
This is the apartment of a man named Jeffries, a news photographer whose beat used to be the world. Right now, his world has shrunk down to the size of this window. He's been watching the people across the way. Nobody seems to pull their blinds during a hot spell like this. He knows a lot about them by now. Too much, perhaps. For instance, down there on the second floor, the woman pacing about. He calls her Miss Lonely Hearts. So lonely that even death seems like a friend. These are the newlyweds on a honeymoon.
So it's interesting that this film comes right at the time that television starts to become really prevalent. And so this idea of watching multiple channels, you're stuck in your couch and you watch these stories that take place on the screens, which are on these windows. And if you look just this little silent piece of it, each window becomes a kind of vignette that you piece together. And so as a viewer, you see all of these different actions, and then the totality comes from the way that you put it together. And that same idea was played out again in '67 by Jacques Tati in Playtime, where, again, the big window, the picture window, and the room behind it become these kind of vignettes or stories that are brought together by the architecture. And so, each screen tells a story, and the architecture becomes a kind of display device of these different lives. But no one probably dealt with the multiple screen as effectively as the American designers Charles and Ray Eames. And this exhibition that happened in Moscow in 1957, The Glimpses of the USA, was one of their first experiments with 7-screen projection. And they created in the American Pavilion at the Moscow exhibition these huge screens that floated over the top, and you could see the whole story of America in 7 screens. But going back to Bayer diagram, they almost reproduced that diagram exactly a couple of years later at the New York World's Fair in the pavilion for IBM. And you can see these arrays of images that are brought together so that the single person can see multiple things at once. And it was all inside this beautiful egg where you kind of started down at the ground, you got into the chairs, and you were brought up inside this egg and inside these screens. And I'll just play a little bit of it for you.
Welcome to the IBM Information Machine. And the Information Machine is just that. A machine designed to help me give you a lot of information in a very short time. It can help us look at things more closely than we normally do. It can pick out and give special emphasis to things we often take for granted. Or it can offer a broad perspective of morning in Manhattan.
So this goes on, but the idea the Eames projected was that actually, rather than something novel, this was actually the way that we really saw and processed information. We always see lots of things at once, and our brains are these tools to bring them all together. And that set off all of these kind of World's Fair experiments with kind of expanded cinema. So here in Montreal in '68, where the Labyrinth was this 5-screen projection, so you kind of saw one story that played out across these huge 5 screens, and then it would do sometimes different things and sometimes the same, and kind of tell the story over time. Or again in Osaka in '72, where you have a 360-degree room where you're kind of surrounded by imagery. And so this became a kind of familiar tool of World's Fair pavilions to kind of immerse yourself in cinema. And in '68 or '67, Rube Goldberg, the American illustrator, did this great cover for Forbes, where he really projected our time now, where basically the world is covered with screens, and everybody has their own one. So Dad's looking at the screen on the ceiling, and the cat has its own little screen on the side, and you have this kind of every person has their own screen. And that starts to play out in all of these ways. So you have the control room, or the security apparatus, or the kind of Wall Street trader with his information surrounding him, which becomes more and more and more information. And part of the power of Wall Street is the idea that the more information you have, the more power you have. So this kind of surrounding in information. And so the idea of the kind of multiple screen where you see the whole world from this one chair becomes a really prevalent metaphor. And maybe the most kind of extreme version of that is, again, in Minority Report, where Tom Cruise actually manipulates all the screens just by moving his arms. And so he kind of becomes the device to distribute all this information. And so the screen itself becomes a kind of connection to the body. So you move and you move the screens that you see. So if we go then into this whole idea of like the screen as this window which is manipulable, and that's a fragmentation of information. That's such a familiar form to us now. We see it all the time, and you don't think about it, that we always are looking at screens that have screens in them. And, it's a part of news broadcast in America, at least, that you have to have the screen that prove that you're surrounded by information. And I really like these guys on the upper left who are just like hanging out with their friend, the screen. It's kind of this third party. Or people talk and have conversations with screens, or talk across long distances. And so the screen becomes this kind of stand-in or metonymy for the human, where one thing is injected into the other. And the next clip is by these guys, some classmates of ours from art school, who did a whole series of projects around cable television in the 90s. And what they were looking at was that this proliferation of screens and with screens, and all the different ways that cable television gives you more and more information compacted together.
Unbelievable high-tech, multi-channel, multi-billion-dollar satellite transmission. 500 channels.
There is too much television.
We watch a lot of television.
I have to say a word in favor of television. There should be
media,
multimedia, entertainment, information,
digitized television, broadcast signal up to satellite and down through a dish.
So basically, like, you're kind of bombarded with information. Each piece of information has its own screen, and that your brain is forced to kind of consolidate it all. But this idea of the window within the window is something, again, we work with every day. Starting the early experiments in Xerox in the 70s, that became part of the Apple Lisa in the early 80s, and then of course everyone now knows that. Either on Windows or Macintosh, you work on a screen which has multiple screens in it. And it's interesting here is, swipe to see everything, click to go anywhere. That the window is seen as a kind of device to bring you to other places. And here, the 2008 film Wall-E, it kind of combines both aspects, which is the motion that people used to walk and look at windows, and then the multiple screen. And so here, the people float, and the screen floats in front of them. And there's lots of different depictions of that. This is a kind of early animation for the Microsoft music player called the Zune. And it's this idea you hold your screen in front of you and you kind of move through space in this kind of very awkward way, like looking through space this way. And then, of course, Macintosh... So what's interesting about this is that it's all about motion, right? It's like suddenly it's about this freedom. The screen travels with you. You have freedom of motion. And, of course, it depicts it in this completely different way. And in this next clip, it's for a Dutch group that makes augmented reality, so the screen that you look through. And what I think is interesting when you watch this clip is look at the relationship of the screen between the person and the world.
Augmented reality is a new mass medium. It's where the real world is combined with digital information.
You're going to bring these digital experiences into reality, and you're going to engage into reality with this new medium.
Today, with Layer, you can experience history, art,
ATM finder, real estate for sale, how things looked 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Foursquare, Twitter, tourism, sports, commerce, gaming, social. Gaming in augmented reality is a completely new genre. Interacting with objects right in front of you. We got crazy shit on there.
We got crazy shit in there. But it's an interesting thing that the screen becomes this kind of window that you're looking at the world through. And so suddenly now you're holding up this thing, and instead of being something that's broadcasting, it becomes transparent again. And so it starts to take on this like window-like quality. So it becomes mobile first, and then it becomes transparent. And this idea of the transparent screen that's a membrane between two people, where instead of being something forcing one way, it becomes dialogic, and that you see through it, and there's something that happens in that relationship.
I read all about your accident.
And so this idea that now the thing that you hold is a way to look at the world rather than a thing that sends information to you. So of course, the final step then is this, right, which is that the kind of virtual reality. And the innovation of virtual reality isn't the screen, because it has a screen like anything else. It's that it's so close to you that you no longer can see the edges. And so what virtual reality does is it removes the frame, and you become inside the screen itself. And so by coming this close to you, now there's no more frame that you look at. It's not looking at this anymore, but it's looking at, it's kind of, this frame is out here somewhere, and you exist inside it. And so the virtual reality changes the screen again into this immersive quality. But if you look here, a kind of virtual reality game where you can try working in a convenience store, what happens in the virtual reality, you get more screens. And so the screen returns again as another part of a landscape. Now you're inside one screen and looking at new ones again. So back to this then, which is what I started with, which is that when Kanye came to us and brought this collage, we had to think about what's the experience of watching something on 7 screens simultaneously. And so to do that, it's actually a really interesting design problem, because you have to think about not only the storytelling, but you have to actually think about the physical space where that storytelling happens. And so we did a lot of calculation thinking about where do people sit and what can they see, and starting to model in very kind of rough forms these little kind of makeshift versions of that in our own studio. So you could set up with projectors and you could start to calculate how do you tell a story in these places. And so we would sit down and just in this very rough way start to work out the film that way. And then that starts to become a model of a real space. And then we went to make the film itself. And so the film was made in the desert in Qatar. And when you think about that, when you design the theater, the screens are in a certain place, but then you need to design a camera. And so the cinematographer had to design a camera that would perfectly match our architecture. And so we have a 7-camera rig, and that rig has to be in motion, and you have to be able to see what you're seeing, so you have to have 7 playback devices also. So it became a way to reproduce the cinema in this small form as we made the movie itself. And then I can't describe the crazy absurdity of making a film in the desert with a whole series of American rappers, and it had this kind of its own quality. But then we had to think about its display, and so this is the symbol for Rockefeller Records, the rap label for Jay-Z and Kanye. And so the theater then starts to take on this form, a kind of pyramid. This is designed in conjunction with Shigematsu. And the theater basically was the idea that the screens would be elevated, the pyramid would elevate the screens, and then the pyramid itself becomes the container for the theater. And so then we built this theater in Cannes at the film festival, and at the casino, so right on the water. And so you have this idea of a kind of floating pyramid under which you walk, and then you go up inside where the cinema is. And so you can see the cinema. You're surrounded by these huge screens, some on the floor, some on the ceiling, and they wrap around you. And then underneath the chairs are gigantic speakers so that you can really feel the music. And the theater itself holds about 250 people, and so you kind of walk up and you sit within these screens, and it becomes this completely enveloping experience. So I can play a little bit of this for you. I'm going to zoom ahead, actually. Well, just to say that when the film starts, just the ceiling opens, and so you have the top screen, something happens, and so you're sitting in the dark, and then a door opens in the ceiling, and people start to climb down into the space. And then they climb down and they do some things. But so you have a point here where first it's totally dark, you only see one screen, and then suddenly all the screens come on, and so you're completely surrounded by this image. And sometimes you have the sense of like you're actually in a space, but then sometimes you have this kind of contrasting between you're looking at two things at once.
Prince of Michael Jordan.
What?
Prince of Michael Jordan.
That doesn't make sense, man. That's like asking me which one I like better, cake or steak.
Cake or steak? That is a good question.
No, it's not a good question. That's the point, man. Listen, the only decision I'm trying to make tonight is Bugatti, McLaren, or Lambo.
Well, if it's right we've on the morning and natural thief, if it's right we've on the morning and natural thief, if it's right weapon that's all.
Okay, Lamborghini Mercy. Yo, chick, she so thirsty. I'm in that 2C Lambo with your girl, she tryna. Okay, Lamborghini Mercy. Yo, chick, she so thirsty. I'm in that 2C Lambo with your girl, she tryna. Okay, Lamborghini Mercy. Yo, chick, she so thirsty. I'm in that 2C Lambo with your girl, she tryna. Okay, Lamborghini Mercy. She so thirsty. I'm in that 2C Lambo with your girl, she tryna.
So you have these points where then the whole thing opens up and you're completely surrounded. And we intentionally started with a chase scene because it's something that everybody understands and knows. And so it immediately orients you to what's going on. But then it goes into all of these kind of complex relationships between the screens where sometimes, you know, you see these one landscape and like some little tiny thing happens and then there'll be some change, and you'll see like suddenly you brought really close to it. So here you see the sand below you and the thing that happens on the top, and then a relationship between all these different pieces. So the screens can have all of these dialogic and interesting components in terms of the way they relate to one another. And sometimes they fill whole spaces, so you can see almost a 180-degree view of a space, or they have these just very beautiful abstractions. And then, of course, the theater itself has to be Instagrammable, because that's the thing, so it becomes the icon for that as well. That's it. Thank you very much.